Within the last 50 years, the rulings of our courtrooms reflect an increasingly secular worldview of our nation's history. Was it ever the intent of our founding fathers to restrict religious freedoms in the public arena? Or is this the result of a new and dangerous political agenda? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten. Until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
When you look back to the original justices, you find that in their courtroom they were not hostile to Christianity or religion.
The rulings of our modern courtrooms bear little resemblance to the original intent of our founding fathers.
The judicial authority is the weakest of all branches. They designed it that way.
What is the responsibility and role of our nation's voting citizens in the judicial process?
The people had ended segregation 75 years before the court did. The people are the best protector of the people's rights, not the court.
What has affected this dramatic and historical change in our local and national courtrooms? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
America was established with three separate branches of government, but over recent decades, the one branch that has become the most dominant, unquestionably, is the judiciary. They now make policies on every aspect of life, whether it's environmental, whether it is civil, whether it is criminal, whether it is religious liberty aspects. It's the Supreme Court that seems to have the final word on every aspect. And that really has not set very well with the American people. What we see is that in recent years, we're seeing now polling that says up to 3/4 of the American people think that judges have gone too far with what they do. The one branch that has become the most hostile to what we would call Judeo-Christian values, and rightly called Judeo-Christian values, has been the judiciary. We have yet to have a law passed in America by legislation that says abortion on demand's fine. That came from judges.
Right.
We have yet to have a law passed in America that says you can't pray at a football game. That came from judges.
Wow.
We have yet to have a law passed in America by any elected representative that says no Ten Commandments displayed anywhere. It came from judges. So much of what we have in the way of national policy didn't come from the people. It didn't come from the two branches closest to the people. It came from the branch most removed from the people.
Now, are those three branches equal?
The three branches we're told are equal. The Federalist Papers absolutely say they were not equal. You look at the Constitution, and when you read Article 1 of the Constitution on the legislature, Article 2 on the executive, and Article 3 on judiciary, Article 1 is the longest. It is Congress that has the most power, the most responsibilities, they're to do the most. Next longest of the three articles is the executive. There's a lot the president does, but the shortest of all the articles is judiciary. They're given very few things, very little jurisdiction. They're the one branch that was not connected directly to the people, so they're the one branch that was not given policy-making power.
Wow.
That was never in their assign at all. Never.
Now, modern day, they have really taken the front position in creating policy and creating the world we live in.
They've been allowed to take the front position. There's a reason that they did not do so for the first 160 years of the nation. The Federalist Papers themselves say that the legislative authority predominates, and they say the judicial authority is the weakest of all branches. They designed it that way because that's the one that people don't have control directly over, so that's got to be the weakest. This signer is Thomas McKean. He was one of America's leading legal authorities, and he was responsible for this 1792 commentary on the Constitution of the United States of America. Thomas McKean not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he also helped author the Constitutions of Pennsylvania and of Delaware, and he served as governor in each of those states. Additionally, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. In the case Respublica versus John Roberts, a trial over which Chief Justice McKean presided, John Roberts was sentenced to death after a jury found him guilty of treason. And back then, a sentence of death meant that the prisoner had 7 to 10 days left on earth, not 15 to 20 years. After reporting the jury's decision and delivering the sentence, Chief Justice McKean then offered these words of wisdom and consolation to John Roberts.
The defendant approached the bench. You will probably have but a short time to live. Before you launch into eternity, it behooves you to improve the time that may be allowed you in this world. It behooves you most seriously to reflect upon your conduct, to repent of your evil deeds, to be incessant in prayers to the great and merciful God to forgive your manifold transgressions and sins, to teach you to rely upon the merit and passion of a dear Redeemer, and thereby to avoid those regions of sorrow, those doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell, where even hope cannot enter. It behooves you to seek the fellowship, advice, and prayers of pious and good men, to be persistent at the throne of grace, and to learn the way that leadeth to happiness. May you, reflecting upon these things and pursuing the will of the great Father of light and life, be received into the company and society of angels and archangels, and the spirits of just men made perfect. And may you be qualified to enter into the joys of heaven, joys unspeakable and full of glory.
Signer of the Declaration, Thomas McKean, was another of our many founding fathers who was a strong Christian. When you look back to the original justices, I mean, we literally have signers of the Declaration. We have founding fathers. We have individuals who wrote America's first legal commentaries that were judges. And you find that in their courtroom, they were not hostile to Christianity or religion. You actually find folks like Thomas McKean, when someone was sentenced to death in his courtroom, he'd give an altar call. Oh. And we think, that's not appropriate for courts. Well, who told us that? Well, the last 30 years. This is a book from another very, very famous early judge. His name was Jacob Rush, Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Interesting little section he has in here on this book. It's an address he gave on the sentence of death. This was in November of 1797. An individual had been sentenced to die. He said, "You've had a fair and impartial trial. The witnesses have been examined in your presence. You selected your own jury. You've been ably and zealously defended by your own counsel." So he's had all the due process, and the jury still found him guilty. So he's been sentenced to death for this murder. This is what the judge says. He says, "As you have but a short time to live in this world, and there's no hope of pardon from any earthly hand, let me urge you to seek a pardon from above." And he goes on through to tell him how to find that pardon from above, how to pray and what God can do for him if he'll ask forgiveness. So there was not a hostility at all. As a matter of fact, you'll find that the folks like Charles Finney, who was a great revivalist in the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney, born in 1792, Charles Finney made it real clear in his autobiography, he didn't want to be a minister. He wanted to be an attorney. So he entered the study of law. And in the study of law at that time, early America, he said that as he read his law books, when it gave the law, it also gave the Bible verse on which the law was based. He said in the process of reading his law books that he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian by studying his law books. Now, that's not going to happen today. I mean, we're real hostile toward religious expressions. But you go into the original Supreme Court, they had prayer in the Supreme Court. They would not let a jury go out to deliberate till they brought a minister in to pray over the jury. The jury needs to get the mind of God on this verdict. We had prayer in the courtroom. We also had church services in the courtroom. The Supreme Court met inside the U.S. Capitol. It was regularly used as a church room every Sunday. The Supreme Court meets Monday through Saturday, and on Sunday it became a church room. We just did not, as a matter of fact, they had massive communion services in that room. Really, there was a communion service that lasted over 4 hours in that room. Now, I've been to some long church services in my life. I've never been to a 4-hour communion service.
Wow.
But you have that happening inside the court. So you have a lot of pro-religious faith. They're not hostile at all. That certainly has changed, but that was never the way it was designed. I mean, these guys were not there to make policy. Now, the court today has become the policy-making branch, but that was never the design of the Founding Fathers.
The rulings of our modern courtrooms bear little resemblance to the original intent of our Founding Fathers. What has affected this dramatic and historical change in our local and national courtrooms? And what is the responsibility and role of our nation's voting citizens in the judicial process? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
What we're really discussing is that really the judicial branch was not a co-equal in government. Is that the way that the originators, the
That's
original
exactly
intent?
what they said. That is exactly what they said. It is not a co-equal. They also called it a coordinate branch. That's the word they would use. That it was not a co-equal or a coordinate branch in government.
When did it switch over to being a co-equal branch?
It switched over when we, the American people, allowed them that position. We started buying into that. They started becoming very judicially active in the 1950s and 1960s. The Earl Warren Court is known for that judicial activism. They started intruding themselves into areas that had never been allowed to get into before. And there were actually hearings in Congress on impeaching the Supreme Court justices for that activism. And by the way, that's not a radical notion. That's something that we regularly did in American history. You look back at the Founding Fathers, they conducted a number of impeachment inquisitions is what they call it today, but impeachments against judges for malfeasance. And it wasn't, see, today we have this thing that says, oh, you can only impeach a judge maybe for a criminal felony. Maybe you can impeach him. Back at the beginning, the Founding Fathers impeached judges for all sorts of reasons that were different, because the Constitution does not give judges a lifetime appointment. The Constitution says judges are appointed for the duration of, quote, good behavior. Wow. The bottom line is, as long as they act right, they can stay there. So what's it mean not to act right? If you will look at the original reasons that justices got thrown off the court, one got drunk in private life. Well, what's that have to do with what he did on the court? It doesn't matter. That was bad behavior for a judge. Even if it's in private life, they impeached him, took him off the court because he got drunk in private life. Another got thrown off the court for cussing in the courtroom. Well, that's not a crime. No, but it's bad behavior for a judge. Another one ignored an act of Congress. You see, today they do that all the time. Congress passes laws that doesn't apply to us. Matter of fact, we rule just the opposite. Got thrown off for ignoring an act of Congress. I mean, anything that was considered bad behavior for a judge was an impeachable offense. Now today, we've gone and says, oh no, maybe a criminal felony, certainly not a civil felony, and certainly not a misdemeanor. We have so changed the standard that we've told these guys they have lifetime appointments. There's virtually nothing they can do to get themselves thrown off the bench. That was not the case at the beginning. And so we have, over the course of the last 2 centuries, we have over 90 impeachment investigations. We have over 60 some odd impeachment investigations against judges, and we have over a dozen impeachments of judges. And if you look at what the causes were, it's not where we are today. Yeah. So that was one of the ways we kept them under control. There were 6 original justices appointed to the Supreme Court by President George Washington. A practice conducted under these original justices was the regular offering of prayers in the courtroom. According both to the records of the Supreme Court as well as the newspapers of the day, juries in the Supreme Court did not begin their work until after a minister had come into the courtroom and prayed for the court, for the jurors, and for their deliberations. In fact, here is a newspaper account in the Columbian Sentinel of May 16, 1792, which reports very simply, as a matter of fact, on Monday, Chief Justice John Jay gave a charge to the grand jury replete with his usual perspicuity and elegance. The prayer was made by the Reverend Dr. Parker. His Excellency, the Vice President of the United States, was in court. Our founders never saw this practice as a problem, for they never envisioned any hostility toward religion, nor any exclusion of religious faith or practice from public life. This was especially true when it came to religion and the law. The way that the judges really took to themselves this power is they have started screaming that they have the right of judicial review. Now, judicial review is the right for the court to be the final authority on whatever happens. The court takes that back to an 1803 Supreme Court decision called Marbury versus Madison. That is the first occasion in American history where the court reviewed the action of another branch. And what had happened, now this is 1803 when this occurs, Marbury-Madison. All the law books, all the textbooks say this is the origin of judicial review, and this is what the judges and courts rely on as being the source of their power. Let's go back to that little historical incident. You're coming at the end of the election of John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson, that 1801 presidential election. In that election, you have 2 political parties, the Federalist, John Adams, the Anti-Federalist, Thomas Jefferson. The people overwhelmingly choose the Anti-Federalist. Not only is Thomas Jefferson elected president over John Adams, but the people elected an Anti-Federalist House, and they elected an anti-Federalist Senate. So the people have weighed in. We don't want the Federalist Party, we want the anti-Federalist Party from top to bottom. Well, you now have a lame duck president, you now have a lame duck House and Senate. They decide we're going to make sure that this nation stays Federalist and not anti-Federalist. So they pass a bill that authorizes 16 federal judgeships, and they're going to fill those 16 judgeships with Federalist judges, and that way they can keep federalism in the government as opposed to anti-federalism. So John Adams signs that bill. He gives those positions to the Secretary of State, who has to deliver the commissions to these guys who have been named to be judge. They also passed a bill to appoint a number of judges in Washington, D.C. So he gives it to his Secretary of State. Secretary of State forgot to deliver the commissions. They didn't go to those D.C. judges. So when the new administration comes in, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State is James Madison. James Madison finds these D.C. judicial appointments on his desk that they were not delivered to the previous nominees. He says, "Oh, I'm sure not delivering to those guys. No, we don't want Federalist judges on the court." So Madison says, "I'm not delivering them." Well, one of the judges who had been confirmed by the Senate but didn't get his commission because the Secretary of State forgot to deliver it was a guy named Marbury. And he's the one who sued. He said, "Hey, I got confirmed by the Senate. I get the commission. It's been technically approved. I just don't have it in hand." So he takes it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the Chief Justice at that time is John Marshall. And the court is to decide whether this guy should have gotten his commission. Well, the court issued a ruling that said, yeah, that commission should go to him. He was given that judgeship. He should receive it. That was the ruling of the court. And that's what the court uses to say, hey, this is the first time the Supreme Court got involved in telling another branch what to do, and that's the basis. We need to say, time out just a minute. You remember that Secretary of State for John Adams who forgot to deliver the commissions? Yes. Who was his Secretary of State? It was John Marshall. John Marshall forgot to deliver them. Well, John Adams quickly appoints John Marshall over here to be Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So the question in front of John Marshall is, you remember those commissions you forgot to deliver? Should you have delivered them? You know, today we say, time out, conflict. We have a conflict of interest here. This is a bad ethical problem. You can't rule on what you should have done back then. So here he is cleaning up his own mess that he made and saying, I rule that I should have given those to him, so you go ahead and give them to the judges in place of me. At that time, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, President and Secretary of State, went through the roof. They said this is a complete perversion of law for the court to attempt to tell another branch what to do.
Oh, come on.
Jefferson ignored it. James Madison ignored the ruling of the court, paid no attention to it whatsoever. And by the way, that was a practice of the presidents for over 100 years. You see, if you move forward to Abraham Lincoln, the Supreme Court had ruled in the Dred Scott decision and said, you can't end slavery. You can't end it in federal territories. Blacks are property, they're not people. And Abraham Lincoln said, phew, at least it was just the Supreme Court that said that. I don't have to follow it. So Abraham Lincoln goes in and does everything the Supreme Court told him he could not do. You see, each of the branches were independent. One branch couldn't run the other two branches.
The rulings of our modern courtrooms bear little resemblance to the original intent of our founding fathers. What has affected this dramatic and historical change in our local and national courtrooms? And what is the responsibility and role of our nation's voting citizens in the judicial process? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Before being placed on the Supreme Court by President Washington, James Wilson had signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Only 6 founding fathers have that distinction. And at the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson had been the second most active member, speaking on the floor of the convention 168 times. James Wilson, perhaps more than any other man, is responsible for laying the early foundation for a purely American system of jurisprudence. For example, here is a 1792 commentary on the Constitution of the United States of America, of which he was a co-author. And this 3-volume set contains his legal lectures, written and delivered to students while James Wilson was sitting as a justice on the Supreme Court. In fact, Justice Wilson was responsible for starting the first organized legal training in America for law students. Notice what Justice Wilson taught his students about the relationship between law and religion.
It should always be remembered that law made for men or for a nation flows from the same divine source. It is the law of God. What we do indeed must be founded on what he has done, and the deficiencies of our laws must be supplied by the perfections of his. Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. We now see the deep and the solid foundations of human law. From this short but plain and, I hope, just statement of things, we perceive a principle of connection between all the learned professions, but especially between the profession of divinity and the profession of law. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other.
Founding Father and Supreme Court Justice James Wilson, a leading figure in the development of American constitutional law, believed and taught that all good civil law must embrace and flow from God's law. What's the first time the Supreme Court told Congress what to do? It was in 1857. Back in 1820, Congress had passed a law that eliminated slavery in certain territories, part of the Missouri Compromise. 1857, the first time the Supreme Court used judicial review against Congress was in the Dred Scott decision. They said, hey, you know that law you did back in 1820 that said you could end slavery in some of the territories? That's an unconstitutional law. You can't end slavery anywhere because slaves are property, not people. That's the famous case where the Supreme Court said no black has any right which a white man is bound to respect. That's an abominable decision. That's the first use of judicial review against Congress in history. So again, Lincoln ignored that decision as well, as did Congress, because it was just the Supreme Court. I mean, that's all. It wasn't a big deal like it is today. I mean, it's just one of the three branches. So people today, and I get law students and law professors say, yeah, but you know, the court really is good at protecting minorities. It may not have been good back then, but it's really good. As a matter of fact, think about Brown versus Board of Education. That's where the Supreme Court stepped in and ended segregation in education. Wasn't that a good decision? And you can say, well, you know, the outcome of that was certainly very good. Segregation should have been ended in education, and the court said it should have been. But I need to tell you the rest of the story. The rest of the story is not the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. You have to go back to 1875. In 1875, Congress passed a congressional law that banned segregation everywhere. Banned segregation in education, in dining, in restaurants, in transportation. Congress banned segregation in 1875. 1882, the Supreme Court struck down that law and said, oh no, you can't ban segregation. We think segregation is a good thing for society. All the Supreme Court did in Brown versus Board of Education was reverse itself from 70 years earlier. If they had left it to the people had ended segregation 75 years before the court did. The people are the best protector of the people's rights, not the court. John Jay was another original member of the Supreme Court. You may recall that he was a founding vice president of the American Bible Society. Well, 5 years after the founding of that organization, John Jay became its second president. The annual speeches he delivered to that society as its president are powerful declarations of his own beliefs about the efficacy of the Bible.
By conveying the Bible to people, we certainly do them a most interesting act of kindness. We thereby enable them to learn that man was originally created and placed in a state of happiness, but becoming disobedient was subjected to the degradation and evils which he and his posterity have since experienced. The Bible will also inform them that our gracious Creator has provided for us a Redeemer in whom all the nations of the earth should be blessed, that this Redeemer has made atonement for the sins of the whole world, and thereby reconciling the divine justice with the divine mercy, has opened a way for our redemption and salvation, and that these inestimable benefits are of the free gift and grace of God, not of our deserving, nor in our power to deserve. The Bible will also encourage them with many explicit and consoling assurances of the divine mercy to our fallen race, and with repeated invitations to accept the offers of pardon and reconciliation. They, therefore, who enlist in his service have the highest encouragement to fulfill the duties assigned to their respective stations, for most certain it is that those of his followers who participate in his conquests will also participate in the transcendent glories and blessings of his triumph.
By the way, this is a bust of John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is one of the Bibles printed and distributed by the American Bible Society under his leadership.
I am absolutely overwhelmed by what I've been hearing concerning the judiciary and its overreaching, unbelievable.
Well, now we hear that it comes down to 5 people.
It
Pretty
comes
much.
down to 5. And by the way, let me tell you something. We have federal elections in America every 2 years. And every 2 years, you're going to choose 1/3 of the U.S. Senate. And every 4 years, you're going to choose a president or re-choose a president, depending on the circumstances. When any citizen goes to vote in this United States, the number one issue that he looks at for president or for Senate should be, what are you going to do with the judges?
Wow.
Are you going to appoint judges that are strict constructionists that will restrain themselves to what the Constitution says they're going to do? Are you going to give me more judges that think they're legislators?
Yeah.
If you're going to give me judges that think they're legislators, I don't care what else you believe, I'm voting against you because
Right.
you're screwing up the nation for the next 4 decades.
Right.
Because in this culture today, for the last 50 years, there is no part of government that's more dominant than the judiciary. And if we don't start electing presidents and senators willing to keep that branch under control, then it really doesn't matter what Congress does or what the president does because they get the final word on it at the court. And that has to be something that we've got to get a hold of again as citizens. We've got to get that branch back under control. We need to elect presidents and senators who understand there is a separation of powers. That when the Supreme Court says jump, they don't say how high. They say, jump yourself. We're staying over here in our branch.
Right.
If Christians think that, well, this has nothing to do with me because this is not spiritual, you need to go back and see all the things the Bible says about judges.
Yeah.
Ezra 7:25 says, appoint judges who know the laws of God. Psalms 2, verses 10 through 12 says, judges of the earth, fear the Lord, serve his Son. That's a really remarkable verse. You've got scriptures in 2 Chronicles 19, verses 6 and 7, tells judges how to rule. God is all over the issue of judges. As a matter of fact, Isaiah 126, God tells us that judges determine the righteousness of a nation. Man, as Christians, we ought to be all over what kind of judges are going to be appointed.
Right.
That's a biblical issue, and it's time for us to get back engaged in that issue and choose senators and presidents who do the right thing with judges.
For more information on the American Heritage Series or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.